Hey everyone, today I'm going to tell you some stories about massive disasters caused by humans. And with each story, the level of destruction only gets worse and worse. So if you make it all the way to the end of the video, trust me, things are going to get seriously horrifying. First up is the Mesa Redonda disaster. This tragedy took place in a major city in Peru called Lima. In the heart of the city, there was a huge commercial district known as Mesa Redonda. This commercial district was packed with shops selling all kinds of things, pretty much like a massive shopping market. Because of that, all the planes that day were forced to divert to another airport called Los Rodeos Airport. Because of that, places like this were always crowded with people, and no one could have imagined that one day, a horrifying disaster would strike this very place. It happened in 2001, specifically on December 29th. As you can probably tell, this was right near the end of the year, just before New Year's celebrations. So on that day, many different kinds of fireworks were being sold there. The shops started putting all kinds of fireworks on display. And it wasn't just one store either. A lot of other shops were selling fireworks. Well, the place was incredibly crowded that day, and everything seemed completely normal. But then something happened. At one of the fireworks shops, the owner took out some fireworks and lit them up for people to watch. And when the fireworks went off, the crowd loved it. The firework exploded pretty loudly, sending sparks flying everywhere. But nearby, there was a box full of fireworks. So the sparks from the firework that had just been lit ended up falling into that box and set it on fire. Once that box caught fire, it quickly spread to other boxes of fireworks as well, and before long, the entire shop was burning. Once one shop caught fire, all the nearby shops started burning too, because they were all selling fireworks, and before long, it turned into a massive wall of flames. After it happened, the commercial district looked like absolute hell. Fire trucks, firefighters were quickly sent in to battle the blaze immediately, and fortunately, they managed to put out the fire that same night. But once the fire was finally under control, the destruction it left behind was absolutely devastating. Many buildings had been severely damaged, and the worst part of that day was that the fire ended up killing 291 people, while at least 134 others were injured. It is considered one of the deadliest fires ever linked to fireworks. The second disaster was the tragedy at Los Rodeos Airport. This was a disaster that many people could hardly believe because the chances of something like this happening were incredibly low. It happened in 1977, specifically on March 27th. At an airport called Gran Canaria Airport, many planes were preparing to land there, but suddenly, an incident occurred. Someone had bombed the area, making the situation at the airport extremely dangerous. Because of that, all the planes that day were forced to divert to another airport called Los Rodeos Airport. And among the planes there that day, there were two planes directly involved in the disaster. One of them was a white aircraft operated by Pan Am from the United States. On that day, the plane was carrying a total of 396 people. The second plane was called KLM from the Netherlands, and it was carrying 248 people. Both planes were redirected to Los Rodeos Airport, the one I mentioned earlier. This airport was located on the island of Tenerife in Spain. And one thing about this airport was that it sat at a much higher elevation than many other airports. Because the airport was located so high up, it was much closer to the clouds. And on that day, the cloud cover was extremely thick. So to give you an idea, the airport looked something like this, and the atmosphere that day was almost like this. The dense clouds created a heavy layer of fog, making visibility extremely difficult. At this airport, there was a runway like this, where planes would taxi before takeoff or after landing. And it was on that very runway that these two planes moved into position and caused the disaster. At that moment on the runway, the two planes, the white Pan Am and the blue KLM, were positioned like this. First, the KLM plane was instructed to move onto the runway, taxi all the way to the end, then turn around and wait for further instructions. Next was the white Pan Am plane. It was also instructed to move onto the runway and taxis to another position. At this point, you can see that the two planes were facing each other. If viewed from a closer distance, they would look something like this. It might seem like the two aircraft could see each other, but in reality, they were extremely far apart. And let me remind you again that the fog that day was so dense that the two planes could barely see one another. Even the people in the control tower could hardly determine the exact positions of the two aircraft. And right when the two planes were in these positions, something extremely serious happened. The KLM aircraft was communicating with air traffic control, but parts of the transmission were being interrupted by interference. After the communication became unclear, the pilots eventually only caught one thing, and they believed they had been cleared for takeoff. But in reality, no one had actually given them permission to take off. So, the KLM plane that day started speeding up very quickly to prepare for takeoff. And when the two planes began to see each other, it was already too late. The KLM aircraft was moving too fast and could no longer stop. Right after that, an extremely serious collision happened. In this simulation image, the white aircraft is Pan Am. The Pan Am pilots tried to steer to the left to avoid the collision, but in the end, they still could not avoid it. After the collision, the KLM aircraft continued flying for a short distance. Then the engines were damaged, and the plane crashed straight into the ground and burst into flames violently. Meanwhile, the Pan Am aircraft was also extremely heavily damaged. These are images of the wreckage from the KLM aircraft, and these are images of the wreckage from the Pan Am aircraft. The number of passengers killed on the two aircraft was enormous. On the Pan Am aircraft, a total of 335 people lost their lives. As for the KLM aircraft, because it crashed straight into the ground and exploded, the damage was even more severe. All 248 people on board were killed, and that brought the total death toll to 583 people. This event is also known as the Tenerife Airport Disaster, and it is considered one of the worst plane crashes in aviation history. The third disaster was the tunnel disaster in Mecca. To talk about this disaster, I first need to briefly explain something about Islam. Every year, Muslims take part in a pilgrimage called Hajj in the city of Mecca, Saudi Arabia. This is a massive pilgrimage that every Muslim is expected to take at least once in their lifetime. During this pilgrimage, people take part in many different rituals, such as walking around the Kaaba 7 times, climbing Mount Arafat to pray, and performing the ritual of stoning the devil, along with many other ceremonies. And it was during this very pilgrimage that an extremely horrifying tragedy took place. It happened in 1990, specifically on July 3rd. While people were taking part in the pilgrimage, they were passing through a tunnel like this. To give you an idea, there were huge numbers of people inside the tunnel, and right at the tunnel's exit, large crowds were also moving through the area. On that day, something happened that triggered the disaster. Above the tunnel, there was another pathway being used by other pilgrims, but that upper walkway became unstable that day, and unfortunately, it caused several people to fall down, and they fell directly into the crowd that was coming out of the tunnel. At that moment, the crowd near the tunnel's exit started becoming chaotic. And at the same time, another incident happened. People inside the tunnel said that the power suddenly went out that day. Because of that, both the people inside and outside the tunnel began to panic. At this point, people were pushing and shoving each other, desperately trying to get out. And because of the chaos, many people tripped, fell to the ground, and were then trampled by the crowd behind them. To sum up what happened that day, 7 people fell directly into the area around the tunnel's exit. Meanwhile, the tunnel itself lost power completely. And on top of that, the temperature that day reached around 44 degrees Celsius, making it extremely hot. All 3 of these factors eventually led to a horrific tragedy, a deadly stampede that took place right inside the tunnel that day. The disaster caused 426 people to lose their lives after being trampled in the crowd, and it is considered one of the earliest major stampedes with one of the highest death tolls in the history of the annual Hajj pilgrimage. The fourth disaster was the Halifax disaster. This disaster took place at the port of Halifax in Canada. It happened in 1917, specifically on December 6th. On that day, people living near the coastline heard a very loud explosion, and the explosion was so powerful that it destroyed nearly all of the buildings nearby. At that moment, military vehicles and soldiers were mobilized and prepared for combat because people believed the area had been bombed. But in reality, that wasn't the case at all. And to understand what really happened, you'll need to hear the rest of the story. Everything started with two ships. The first ship was called Emo, a Norwegian vessel. The second ship was called Mont Blanc, a French cargo ship. These two ships may have looked like warships, but in reality, they were only transporting goods. On that day, the two ships were traveling across the sea when they accidentally crossed paths. At that moment, the captains on both sides sounded their horns to warn of an incoming collision. But in the end, they still couldn't avoid it in time, and a collision occurred. This could have been seen as a minor collision, but it became the beginning of an enormous disaster. After the collision, a small spark appeared and caused the Mont Blanc to catch fire. The reason the ship caught fire so easily was because it was carrying large amounts of highly flammable cargo. And on top of that, the ship was also transporting something extremely dangerous that day: explosives. Because of that, after burning for a while, the ship eventually exploded. Because the ship was fairly close to the shore at time, people at the harbor witnessed a massive explosion out at sea with their own eyes. And the explosion was absolutely enormous. It destroyed nearly all of the buildings near the harbor, along with many of the people who were unfortunate enough to be there that day. And it left behind a massive fire. This was a photo taken of the explosion's smoke column. It might look normal at first glance, but in reality, the amount of smoke produced was absolutely enormous. And this was a simulation of the damage caused by the explosion. The closer an area was to the center of the blast, the more severe the destruction became. The nearby ship Emo was also heavily affected. The explosion created an enormous wave, and that wave ended up pushing the ship all the way toward the shore. After the explosion happened, artillery and soldiers were sent to the area because at first people believed that war had broken out. But once they discovered the true cause of the explosion, they began focusing on rescuing the injured civilians. The explosion killed 1,782 people and injured more than 9,000 others, and it is considered the largest man-made explosion in history that did not involve nuclear weapons. The fifth disaster was the Chernobyl nuclear plant disaster. This disaster took place at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, located in the city of Pripyat in Ukraine. And this is how the disaster unfolded. It happened in 1986. Inside the Chernobyl plant, there was something called a nuclear reactor, which looked like this. The image I'm showing you is actually from a different power plant, but overall, it was fairly similar. This nuclear reactor was constantly extremely hot, which meant it always needed to be cooled with water. And in order to continuously pump water into the reactor, the plant relied on an electrically powered pumping system. So if the power went out, there would be no way to keep pumping water into the nuclear reactor. And that raised a major concern. How could they continue supplying water to the reactor in the event of a power outage? The engineers eventually came up with a solution. And based on what I've read, I'll explain it in the simplest way I understand it. When the nuclear reactor was operating, it produced an enormous amount of heat. That heat was then used to spin a steam turbine, and as the turbine rotated, it generated electricity. The electricity would then power the water pumping system, which pumped water back into the reactor to keep it cooled. In the event of a power outage, this system was designed to keep the cooling process running for a certain amount of time. At least, that's the way I understand it. And if anyone watching knows more about the technical side of it, feel free to leave a comment below so everyone can understand it better. After determining the approach, the engineers began testing. During the test, they had to reduce the reactor's power output and then increase it again, among other factors. Then one day, people living near the plant heard a very loud explosion, which caused part of the facility to be damaged. Not long after that, they heard another explosion, and this time it was even larger than the first one. The first explosion is believed to have been a steam explosion. To put it simply, the steam pressure became extremely high and overheated, causing the top of the nuclear reactor to explode. The second explosion happened directly inside the reactor itself, which made it far more powerful. Later on, many experts believed that it was actually a hydrogen explosion. After the explosions occurred, 2 engineers were killed immediately. In addition, another 237 workers were injured. Out of those 237 people, 134 suffered from acute radiation sickness. That meant they had been exposed to an extremely high level of radiation within a short period of time. Out of those 134 people, 28 later died. Together with the two engineers from earlier, the total came to 30 deaths. According to some other sources, one additional worker also died, which is why the official death toll is often reported as 31 people. But in reality, the true number of deaths is estimated to be around 4,000 people. That was because when the plant exploded, it released a massive amount of radioactive dust into the environment. And when people were exposed to this radiation, and after a few months or years, they could develop cancer, and which eventually led to death. The city of Pripyat, where the Chernobyl plant was located, later became an abandoned city in Ukraine because the environment there had been severely contaminated by radiation. And it is considered one of the most destructive and costly nuclear disasters in human history. The sixth disaster was the London disaster. This was a disaster that happened very quietly, and at the time, people did not realize how dangerous it truly was. It happened in 1952, around December. At that time, the weather in London was extremely cold, and when the weather became this cold, people started heating their homes more often. Back then, most people mainly used low-grade coal with high sulfur content for heating. Nearly every house had a coal fireplace. People would put coal into it and burn it to keep warm. Because the weather was so cold, people were using a lot of coal. And that also meant a large amount of coal smoke was being released into the environment. It wasn't just the residents using coal. Factories across London were also using a lot of coal at the time. So the amount of smoke coming from those factories was also very high. And at that time, London especially had a great deal of fog. And to sum it all up, people were using a lot of coal for heating. Factories were also burning large amounts of coal. The amount of emissions kept increasing. And on top of that, there was thick fog everywhere. All three of these factors combined to create a massive layer of smog that covered London, and it became known as the Great Smog of London. At that time, the air in London was covered by a heavily polluted yellow fog, and the fog became so dense that when some people stepped outside, their visibility was only about 1 meter. In other words, they could barely see anything beyond a meter in front of them. This smog began on December 5th, and it was not until December 9th that the fog finally started to clear. Although this disaster lasted for only 5 days, it caused the deaths of around 4,000 people, and according to later estimates, the actual number may have been as high as 10,000. In addition, more than 100,000 other people became ill, and most of them suffered from respiratory infections. So in my opinion, this wasn't a terrifying explosion disaster like the previous ones, but the level of damage it caused may have been many times greater. The seventh disaster was the tragedy of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. There's a good chance you've already heard about this event, so I'll just briefly summarize what happened at the time. It happened in 1945, during the time when World War II was still ongoing and many countries were involved in the conflict. Among them, the United States was fighting against Japan. At the time, the United States was part of the Allied powers, while Japan belonged to the Axis powers. At that point, the United States believed it had already suffered too many losses, so they needed to find a way to bring the war to an end. But Japan showed no signs of wanting to stop. Because of that, the United States launched a project called the Manhattan Project. This was a program focused on researching and developing nuclear weapons, and it had been underway since 1942. So at that point, the United States believed this was the most suitable time to use nuclear weapons in order to force Japan to surrender. After that, the United States selected the first bombing target in Japan, and that place was the city of Hiroshima. The reason was because the city contained many military bases along with important industrial areas of Japan. And in Hiroshima, on August 6, 1945, the United States flew aircraft over the city and dropped a bomb directly onto it. When the bomb was around 580 meters above the ground, it exploded and produced an extremely blinding flash of light. Right after that, a massive explosion created a giant mushroom-shaped fire cloud, destroying nearly everything within a radius of around 1.6 kilometers. This was Hiroshima before the bombing, and this was Hiroshima after the bombing. Almost no buildings were left standing. The bomb used by the United States that day was called Little Boy, and it killed around 80,000 people instantly. Later on, the total recorded death toll rose to around 140,000 people. That was because many people were exposed to radiation from the nuclear explosion and later developed cancer and died from it. After dropping the first bomb, the United States demanded that Japan surrender. But Japan showed no signs of surrendering. So 3 days later, the United States selected another target, and that place was the city of Nagasaki. After that, they decided to drop another nuclear bomb there. In Nagasaki on August 9th, 1945, the United States dropped the second bomb. When the bomb was around 503 meters above the ground, it exploded. And this time, the explosion was far more powerful than the previous bomb, while also destroying nearly everything within a radius of around 6 kilometers. The second bomb looked like this, and it was called Fat Man. This bomb was far more powerful than Little Boy, but the number of immediate deaths was lower, at around 22,000 to 75,000 people. And the final estimated death toll later reached around 8,000 people. This was Nagasaki after the bombing. If you look into the distance, you can see that almost no buildings were left standing. These were the two smoke clouds from the explosions. Hiroshima was on the left, and Nagasaki was on the right. The clouds were absolutely enormous, rising even higher than the layer of clouds above them. And after the two bombs were dropped, Japan declared its surrender just a few days later. Let me tell you something else that was quite terrifying at the time. Before the United States successfully developed the atomic bomb, another group had already begun researching this kind of weapon. That was Germany's nuclear weapons project, which was also being carried out during World War II. But in the end, the project failed, and Germany was unable to create a nuclear weapon. Because if Germany had actually succeeded in developing a nuclear bomb at that time, then no one can really imagine how the world might have ended up. All right? And those were some of the disasters caused by humans. And of course, there are still many more disasters out there. If there are any other disasters you'd like me to cover, feel free to leave a comment below. That's all for now. See you next time.